I'm really excited about. We're going to dive into this book of Job, and here's what I'm excited about. Is I think a lot of people think they're familiar with Job, right? Because we heard about it in Sunday school, and if I were to tell you that Job is actually a really long book with 42 chapters in it, how many of you would be surprised by that? Trevor would. A few people were a little more I would be surprised by that. Like, to hear most people talk, it's like a whole bunch of horrible stuff happens to Job. Job is really quiet and suffers, and then the end, right? And it's like, no, actually, Job says a lot of stuff. Job really speaks his mind to God, and yet God tells him that he's blameless and righteous. As I was getting ready for this, I was thinking about, any of you into comic strips? Like when I was a young person, I would always they used to have these things called newspapers. And it used to be the only way people would get like the news. Like something would happen and people just would not know until the next day when the newspaper arrived. And I would always frantically wait for my parents to finish with the newspaper so that I could get the comics page. And I had Calvin and Hobbes was my favorite. But I also really liked Peanuts. And because, with Charlie Brown and Linus, Lucy, she's a little devil. No, they're all like 6 years old. That was weird. But one of my favorite characters was Snoopy, right? And Snoopy did all sorts of stuff. He was a World War I fighter, ace pilot. He was an expert cook. He could dance. He was a friend of birds. He was also a writer. And every once in a while, he'd be banging around on his typewriter, and all of his books started the same way. It was a dark and stormy night. Yeah. See, that was an appropriate time to whistle. Not the other time. But here's what I thought about this, is that's kind of like the story of Job, right? Yeah, that light, it's going to keep doing that. Here's what happened earlier this morning, right before church. A transformer blew up. It's not great. And it knocked out like half of our power outlets. Yeah, no, it was a Decepticon, so it's okay. It blew up, so like half of our power is out, and this emergency light can't make up its mind. It's really weird. Like our dim lights work, but our brighter lights, only half of them work. Only half of the outlets work. There's sections of the building where other things, like my office, the lights don't turn on, but the computer will turn on. That's weird. Over the course of this hour, the air conditioning is not working over here. There's no power for that. So here's the deal. If you talk a lot, that's going to put a lot of hot air out into the air to make it hot. If I'm the only one talking, it's still going to get hot, but not as hot. Got it? Let's go. So, it was a dark and stormy night. And here's why I got a kick out of that. Is like that is the book of Job, right, man? Job has a dark and stormy night. And I think why the book of Job is important to us is all of us are going to have moments in our life where we feel like we have dark and stormy nights. But before we dive into the book, I want to set the stage a little bit with a little bit of context, a little bit of like, here's what's the deal about the book of Job. And here's the context. We don't know who wrote it. Which is always a weird feeling when you talk about a book of the Bible and you're like, yeah, we don't know who wrote it. We can still have confidence that it has authority, especially since the New Testament even references Job a little bit, right? So we know that God thinks this book is important and has value to us. God was able to use it and provide it in a way for us to learn from and benefit from. But for whatever reason, God didn't think we needed to know who wrote it. Here's what's even trippier, because we don't know who wrote it, and the writing style of it is super complex. The story is set before the time of Moses, which is like more than 3,500 years ago. But scholars, I was laughing because one commentator I wrote that scholars all agree that it was probably written around 3,000 years ago. And then another one of them I read said scholars all agree that it was written like 2,300 years ago. And I was like, I don't think they understand what all agree means. because that's a big difference, 700 years. The point is, we don't know who wrote it, and we're not entirely sure when it was written. We know that we have copies from at least 2,300 years ago. Maybe it was written even older based on the language and the words in it. Here's the trippiest part. And here's what might throw some of you for a loop. Melissa's shaking her head because this really freaked her out earlier this year, and I'll let her tell that story sometime. She's still processing it. One of the things that surprised me when I started reading all of these different commentaries and all of these different experts who have written about the book of Job is that a lot of them think that the writing style of it, the way it's presented, what's going on with it, is that it may actually be a parable instead of a literal piece of history. And there's a few reasons why they think that. One of the reasons they think it is because a lot of it is actually poetry, right? And so that gets kind of like, do you use poetry to record actual history? There may have been an actual man named Job, and he may have had horrible things happen to him. But over time, those stories were maybe expanded or made more dramatic to drive home a theological message. In the New Testament, one of Jesus' major teaching tools is parables, stories that he makes up that are usually extreme stories, extreme situations, so that he can make a dramatic point through those parables. Oftentimes, not even the point people think they're going into it for. Well, a lot of scholars think that might be what's going on here, because as we look at it, we're going to see some situations where, like, is God really just having this holding court with all these angels coming, and one of them is Satan? We're going to talk about that in a minute. And they're all just like hanging out and talking, and God is making bets about how people are going to react. And it's like, I don't know. There's a parable in the New Testament called the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. And in that parable, God is portrayed up in heaven, right? And Lazarus goes to heaven, the rich man goes to hell, and they're all like talking to each other across this great chasm. And here's the deal. We all know that's not how heaven or hell works, but Jesus told the story in that way to make a point. And so a lot of people wonder, perhaps Job really happened as it was written. It would be kind of wild that they were able to write down word for word all of the speeches that happen in this book. It's like 42 chapters and like 28 of them are speeches. Who's writing down all these details and stuff? Or it could be a parable based on someone where bad things happened that God took to another level to make a point, right? Which kind of helps resolve one of the biggest challenges I've always had with the book of Job. I don't know if any of you have had this frustration of reading it and being like, why is God being so cruel to this guy? Like, why did this guy deserve it? And you start to go, well, if it's a parable, it's an extreme example to make a point. It doesn't necessarily mean that God was making this bet about Job. So what was it about? I think this parable is going to teach us something else. And let's jump in and start seeing what it says to us. Got it? Job, chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. There once was a man named Job, it's almost like a once upon a time, right? Like, this is a story told to make a point. There once was a man named Job who lived in the land of Uz. He was blameless, a man of complete integrity. Now, nowhere in Job does it say that Job was sinless. It says he was blameless, right? It means that compared to other people, he was righteous, but it doesn't mean that he was like sinless and perfect. It means that he had this outstanding reputation. It says he feared God and stayed away from evil. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters. Seems excessive. He owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 teams of oxen, and 500 female donkeys. He also had many servants. He was, in fact, the richest person in that entire area. And then it goes on to describe some more about him, how he was really great at this, and he even talks about how much he loved his kids, and he would do sacrifices for them all the time, just in case they had done something to offend God, and he didn't know about it, or they didn't realize, and they hadn't done a sacrifice. Like, this was a guy that went above and beyond. He wasn't sinless, but he was a really, really good guy. Like, literally the best guy in the world. And now that we've gotten 6 verses into it, it gets weird. One day, the members of the heavenly court came to present themselves before the Lord, and the accuser, Satan, came with them. "Where have you come from?" the Lord asked Satan. Satan answered the Lord, "I have been patrolling the earth, watching everything that's going on." Let's talk about Satan for a moment. This is fascinating. Well, I think it's fascinating. We're going to find out if you all think it's fascinating. Awesome. Who said it? You're my favorite, Daniel. Don't let anybody tell you any different. Yeah, no, you're not. Not anymore. Actually, you're pretty up there. You're going to Gordon. I really like that. Okay, so here's what's interesting. If you notice, I read that with a tone that was a little bit more like a lot of times we read this, and what do? We see Satan, and we're like, well, then God must be like, "Where have you come from?" Right? And then Satan answers, "I have been patrolling and watching everything that's going on." Like we put these evil voices on it. But let me tell you something really interesting here. The word here that's used for Satan all throughout the book of Job, right? Not just this one situation, is actually this ancient Hebrew word, hasatan, right? Which means the has is the, and Satan is accuser or challenger, is what it literally means. Now, because this sounds like Satan, translators way back in the day wrote it down as Satan. But the thing is, and all of my sources agree, like this isn't something that they debate, is this is not the name of a being. Okay? This is a title. The challenger, the accuser. What a lot of people realize is that because of the way it was translated, a lot of us assume this is the Satan that we read about in the New Testament. But that's a different word used in a different way. This appears to be just a title. And so when you realize that, you go, man, this probably wasn't the evil, like, devil that we think it was. This might have just been another angel who part of his task in this parable, in this story, was to be going around gathering information and giving reports to God. So he's like, hey, I've been patrolling the earth, watching everything that's going on. It changes a little bit of the tone of it. So then the Lord asked Satan, the Lord asked this challenger, have you noticed my servant Job? This is also interesting because a lot of people, because of their bias, thinking this must be Satan, the evil one, think he's initiating all of this stuff that happens to Job. But it's actually God, right? God brings up, he says, have you noticed my servant Job? He's the finest man in all the earth. He is blameless, a man of complete integrity. He fears God, stays away from evil. Satan, the challenger, replied to the Lord, yes, but Job has good reason to fear God. You have always put a wall of protection around him and his home and his property. You have made him prosper in everything he does. Look how rich he is. But reach out and take away everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. All right, you may test him, the Lord said to Satan. Do whatever you want with everything he possesses, but don't harm him physically. So Satan left the Lord's presence. Is anyone else like, what in the world is going on? The fancy term for what this challenger is questioning God about is called retribution principle. Yeah, I know. That's not helpful at all. Back in the day, what ancient Israelites believed is that if you were doing good things, God would bless you. And if you were sinning, God would punish you. That's why there's a moment in the New Testament where they see this blind guy and the disciples say to Jesus, hey, who sinned to make him blind? Was it him or was it his parents? And Jesus goes, nobody sinned. He's just blind, so I can do a miracle now. It was a shocking moment for the disciples of going, why would somebody be blind if they hadn't done something evil? Why? Because everyone just kind of believed if you had things going wrong in your life, God must be mad at you. And if you had good things going on in your life, God must be happy with you. Which doesn't add up, because we all know evil people who are really rich or have a lot of power or get away with a lot of things, right? And we've all seen bad things happen to good people. So even though this is not actually something God has set up, it's what a lot of people kind of believe. And we still kind of do it today. We kind of have superstitions or things that will react or be like, oh, this must be because they screwed up or they did that, or oh, this must be going wrong because their parents didn't do a good job parenting or whatever. Like, there's all of these things that we kind of think that are still kind of the same idea of retribution principle, that what happens to us is because of something we did. In 1 Peter, I made a slide. The righteous prosper, the wicked suffer. In 1 Peter 2:20, Peter writes, if you suffer for doing good and endure patiently, God is pleased with you. Right? That God's principle is actually, hey, if you suffer and handle it well, and you didn't deserve it, it doesn't mean you did something to get it. But if you handle it well, that honors God. So, back to the retribution principle. The book of Job is this parable really dealing with this belief that a lot of people had back in the day. A lot of us go into it thinking the book of Job is about Job being tested. But what we're going to see is that actually it's about God being tested. This challenger is putting together a thing to say, hey, God, I don't think your wisdom in this is that great. Right? Because what he's saying is the only reason Job praises you is because you've given him all this stuff. In other words, what the challenger is saying is, hey, this whole retribution thing, which isn't how God operates, but how a lot of people believed God operated, and so this parable kind of deals with it. He goes, this whole way of operating sets people up to actually be unrighteous. Because if you get good things because you're righteous, well, now your motive for getting those things is to get the things, not to honor God. You get what I'm saying? Right? Like, has anybody here ever done something good because it was going to be good for you? Right? Like you look like you're being really serving or helpful, but it's really because you want to have a cool photo on your social media so everybody thinks you're a wonderful person. Or you help someone out because you think, hey, if I get in good with this person, I'm going to get something else better down the line. Some people are shaking their heads no. You're holier than me. I've done stuff like that, right? Like, I've been like, I don't know what's the... This angel's going, man, if people are being righteous for the wrong reasons, it defeats the whole point of this. So God is essentially going, all right, let's put it to the test. He goes, let's put my wisdom, my plan, my ability to work to the test. And then the dark and stormy night comes for Job. In the following verses, it describes how first, all in one day, all of Job's herds were stolen and his farmhands were killed. Then his sheep and his shepherds were destroyed by fire from heaven. Not great. His camels were stolen and his servants with the camels were killed. And then all 10 of his children were killed when a mighty wind came and knocked down the house that they were in. In the space of a day, everything he had was taken from him. His wealth, his status, his children. And something ancient Israelites would notice that might not jump out at us is all of these disasters are listed as consequences for sin in Deuteronomy 28, in the ancient book of the law. Right? It would not look good to those around Job, like Job must have done something bad for God to do all of these Deuteronomy 28 punishments to him. Job chapter 1, verse 20 through 22 gives Job's response. Job stood up and tore his robe in grief. Then he shaved his head and fell to the ground to worship. He said, I came naked from my mother's womb, and I will be naked when I leave. The Lord gave me what I had, and the Lord has taken it away. Praise the name of the Lord. In all of this, Job did not sin by blaming God. The ancient Hebrew, this is a lot of ancient Hebrew today. The ancient Hebrew word for worship here actually means bow down, right? And so early translators kind of took that as, oh, he must be worshiping. And there is a piece of this that is worshipful, but the attitude of bowing down is much more of Job is accepting God's will. Everything that happened, and Job's response is, I accept your will, God. You gave it to me, you can take it away. And in all of this, in how he reacted, Job did not sin by blaming God. But the story isn't over. Chapter 2 gets worse, right? It opens with the scene up in God's heavenly court again, with the challenger returning to report. God brags about how Job has stayed blameless through it all, to which the challenger says, yeah, of course, which, the challenger thought in chapter 1 this would do the trick. But he goes, of course. But if you take away his health, it all goes out the window. So God tells the challenger, do whatever he wants as long as he doesn't kill Job. In other words, he's like, let's make the bet even more. Again, it's God in the story initiating. Why? Because this is a test of God, not a test of Job. So it says, so Satan left the Lord's presence, and he struck Job with terrible boils from head to foot. Job scraped his skin with a piece of broken pottery as he sat among it. It's like one of my least favorite verses in the Bible, right? It's just so, makes me feel a little nauseous. He scrapes his skin with a piece of broken pottery as he sat among the ashes. His wife said to him, are you still trying to maintain your integrity? Curse God and die. But Job replied, you talk like a foolish woman. Another way to put this is not foolish, but to say you're giving a ridiculous solution, right? It has a little bit of a different sense than we would take it today. It says you talk like a foolish woman. You're giving a ridiculous solution. Should we accept only good things from the hand of God and never anything bad? So in all of this, Job said nothing wrong. It's so gross. A similar thing happens in Luke 16 with the parable of the rich man and Lazarus that I was talking about. It describes, when Jesus describes Lazarus, at one point he describes it, says, as Lazarus lay there longing for scraps from the rich man's table, the dogs would come and lick his open sores. Yeah, the Bible gets a little gross sometimes. Those make me cringe. Here's what I think is interesting. There's a few things I want to point out. The first is Job's wife gets a bad rap because hundreds and hundreds of years ago, some people read this and were like, Job's wife is awful. So then we've all kind of read this in the tone of, you still trying to maintain your integrity, curse God and die. What kind of wife says that, right? Right, but that's how we kind of read it. Here's the interesting thing. This word curse, I think this is the last ancient Hebrew word I'm going to give you today, is an ancient Hebrew word, barak. And what's fascinating about this Hebrew word is it actually has two meanings. It can be translated bless or curse. Right? How does that make sense? It's such a contradiction. But here's the deal. Scholars are pretty divided on which way this should actually be translated. Should it be translated that she's saying curse God and die, or is she saying bless God and die? And here's why this is interesting. I don't know if any of you have experienced this, but I've had moments in my life where older family members or other people I've known were dying and suffering a lot, right? I remember when my grandpa was dying and my mom was with him, and one of the hardest things for her to say to him, but he was suffering so much, is at one point she was like, Dad, it's okay to stop fighting, right? You don't need to keep. He wasn't going to come back from it. So by him fighting, all he was doing was prolonging the suffering. And so she was like, Dad, you can let go. You don't need to, right? She wasn't sitting there going, Dad, just die. right? Her tone was a loving, like, the most merciful thing for you right now with all the suffering you're going through is to just let go and be with God. And so some people wonder, is this what Job's wife is doing? Is, going, are you still trying to maintain your integrity? Bless God and die. She's going, just let it go. You don't need to hang on. You've lost, go be with God. So it's an interesting thing, for crying out loud. I know, right? Anyways, here's the thing, though. If Job did what she said, right, in either tone, whether the good reason or the bad reason, if Job was like, you know what, I'm going to die. It's not worth living anymore. The book would end really early. We wouldn't get the other 40 chapters. It would also mean that the challenger would win the bet. Because again, Job would be, whether it was the bless God or curse God, either way, Job would be going, my life is not worth living if I don't get the things that I thought I deserved because of my righteousness. Right? Job is still honoring God in this moment of continuing to persevere, to, in all of this, still saying nothing wrong. Right? So it goes on. The chapter ends with 3 of Job's friends arriving and grieving with him silently. They just show up and they just sit with him for 7 days, grieving quietly. And the last sentence says, no one said a word to Job, for they saw that his suffering was too great for words. And I think a lot of us read to this point, and we don't read the next 40 chapters, and we just kind of go, sometimes I've heard people say, we need to suffer like Job, silently, accepting what God is doing. In chapter 3, he cuts loose on God and tells him how he feels about it, how upset he is, how much it hurts, that he'd rather be dead. Job does not suffer quietly, but Job does suffer in a way that honors God, which is interesting. I think we're going to learn from that. But what I want to get back to today is the main point, that the book of Job is not about Job being tested. It's about God being tested. It's about God. I like how one person put it. He wrote, the book of Job is a thought experiment, a parable. God did not actually destroy Job's life in such an extreme manner and make a point about his own wisdom and control. He gave this story to make the point, perhaps about a real person, but exaggerated to make this point. Because the reality is, God is not cruel. Not in the way that we might think he is from this parable. There's 3 big takeaways that I think we can learn from today from this ancient story. The first is that God is wise. One of the themes of Job is that God is wise. As much as this challenger thinks God's plan and way of doing things is wrong, God is going to show him, my wisdom, my plan is bigger than what you think it is. The challenger didn't know how good Job would react. Job didn't know how he would react, but God knew. God knows his ways are just. What we're going to see over the course of this book is that just because people believed in the retribution principle, it doesn't mean that's how God operates. The second thing I think we learn from this opening to Job is that God is in control. Which for Job, it probably didn't always feel like that, right? And I think a lot of us have had moments where horrible things happen or we go through terrible things and we go, what is going on? But part of how Job was able to continue honoring God is by recognizing that, hey, I don't get it, but somehow God is in control of this. Ultimately, God is the one with all the power. In Matthew 19:26, Jesus said, humanly speaking, it's impossible, but with God, everything is possible because of God's power. One last point. Job's faith is an example for us, right? In this parable, in this story, Job doesn't know about the stories happening in heaven. He doesn't know there's this cosmic bet being played out with his life, that he's just a piece of it. And it's this parable. It's a story. It's an extreme example. But the response that he has in this story is an example for us, because he says, the Lord gave me what I had, and the Lord has taken it away. Praise the name of the Lord. That through it all, Job has this incredible faith. He gets upset at God. He questions God. We're going to see that in future weeks. He gets really mad. Like, he grieves loudly. But at the same time, he still has this faith in God throughout it all that we can learn from, that we can take as an example as we go through hard times, that we can hurt and we can be upset and we can be honest with God about that, but that we can also have the faith that, hey, I don't get what's going on, but God is doing something here. And it is a lot easier said than done, right? It's a lot easier for me to stand here and say that than it is to actually live it. But I think each of us, if we think about it, have known someone or have someone in our life that can be an example of someone who went through hard times but kept their faith in God. And man, we can learn from their example. We can learn from Job's example that it is possible to still honor God even while suffering and being honest with that pain and grieving it. All right, let me pray. Those were the big points. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for your word. We thank you for this book of Job. And there's so much in it. And God, I ask that you would teach us from it, that we would learn to grow in our faith like Job in you, even when we're going through difficult times, that we would trust your wisdom, that we would trust your power. I pray that you'd help each of these young people this week, and wherever it is, that they would be getting closer and closer to you. For those of us going on the mission trips next week, God, I ask that you would calm nerves, that you'd help us to remember all of the things we need to do to get ready, that we would be able to make the most of these opportunities for your glory. In Jesus' name, amen.